In this video, we're going to take a look at what role did political parties and specific leaders play in the development of democracy in South Africa. And so here we have de Klerk, kind of destroying apartheid. So let's start with de Klerk himself and the National Party. Since 1948, as we know, the National Party has committed to white domination and enforcing apartheid. But Frederick William de Klerk, F.W. de Klerk, he replaces P.W. Botha as the NP leader, and then later on as president in 1989. Botha stepped down. He was starting to get sick. I can't remember exactly why. But because of his sickness, he steps down. De Klerk replaces him as the new kind of party leader, and thereby, because it's a different system, whoever's party leader becomes president. So de Klerk he's more open to reform, and he realized the urgency of the situation. He realized everything's falling apart around him, the world is changing with the Cold War, so it's time to change. So Botha's out, de Klerk's in, and de Klerk has some different views. And so in 1990, he calls for negotiations, and this was unexpected. They had this long tradition of apartheid, and then this guy comes along and it changes everything. He said he was influenced by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the Cold War, which means all of a sudden his UK and US alliances are going to leave, and the US and the UK could start to hurt them economically too, so it's time to change. Not all National Party members were ready for that change or supported these reforms. Some called for some type of other change so they can maintain their dominance. And so they thought about creating an alliance with the more conservative Inkatha Freedom Party to retain some power. They were worried about repealing apartheid laws, what would happen. They were worried about the returning of political exiles, of releasing Mandela. They were worried about the influence of South African Communist Party in the negotiations, so they're filled with worries. And in some cases, they go even more far right. They double down on apartheid for the right-wing Conservative Party. And then some even start to support the militaristic AWB, which is calling for violence to maintain that white supremacy. But de Klerk is ready to see it all crumble. So to kind of make sure that the people are supporting him, he calls for a referendum, a big vote where he asks the people of South Africa, and by people of South Africa in this case, I mean the white voters, he asks them, hey, do we want reform? Are you ready for change? And so they have a 1992 election on whether or not to continue these negotiations. And 69% of white voters said, yes, it's time to reform. And so this gave the National Party and it gave de Klerk much more confidence in negotiations. He knows that the people are behind him. And he adopts a tougher stance to include special protections for minority rights and a coalition government. So he's going to fight harder to basically maintain at least some white power in the government, but definitely not a white-dominated government. And so he's seeing and starting to realize that it's a white minority, and he's trying to protect that minority right. And so this is a map of the different states and districts as far as how they voted, and the vast majority vote yes. More on de Klerk and the National Party. Contested talks were dominated by the ANC and NP chief negotiators because those are the two main parties. And so at the ANC, we got Cyril Ramaphosa, and from the NP, it's Rolf Meyer. So these are the two head negotiators, but not the two top leaders necessarily. The two top leaders are de Klerk and Mandela. And so during the negotiations, de Klerk repeals the leftover apartheid laws, so the Group Areas Act, the Population Registration Act, the PASS laws, the Separate Amenities Act with the segregation, that's all ending. So here they are tearing down a whites-only beach sign, so the beach is now for everybody. And just because of their negotiations, not even the achievement of finishing it, but just by starting these negotiations, the world decides, to give them the Nobel Peace Prize. And so in 1993, they got a joint Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Mandela and de Klerk for their efforts to end apartheid. And so these are the third and fourth men to achieve the Nobel Peace Prize from South Africa. The other guys were the Luthuli and Tutu. 1994, with the negotiations over and the election, de Klerk gets second place, so he serves as deputy president under Mandela in the power-sharing government. In 1997, he resigns as leader of the National Party and he retires from politics. But as soon as he retires, the National Party just falls apart. They don't know what to do now that they no longer dominate South Africa. Now moving on to the ANC. As we remember, they were banned in 1960. A lot of their leaders were imprisoned, like Mandela, when the MK was formed, because at that point they started to get violent and the government had cause to arrest them. In other cases, leaders went into exile otherwise they would have been arrested or possibly assassinated. Oliver Tambo, he ran the ANC in exile from London and then later on in Lusaka, Zambia, although there were still attempts on his life. Tambo built international support for the ANC and the anti-apartheid struggle, so his main work was getting other countries convinced to boycott and fight apartheid in other ways. The ANC in the meantime was also training MK guerrillas to operate underground in South Africa, so they had training camps in places like Zambia. But Tambo's big job was getting the world to turn against South Africa. Eventually the ban was lifted in 1990 as the negotiations began, and we started to move from an exiled liberation movement, where they're working in London and Zambia, and now they have to go back into South Africa, build up new party structures, build up a new ANC inside South Africa again. And this led to a lot of differences in opinion about what to do, about policy and tactics, between those that were outside of the country, they were exiled, or the imprisoned leaders, and the leaders of the United Democratic Front. So we start to see differences as opposed to those that were in prison or outside of the country, or those that were inside the country but underground. Some of the ANC leaders wanted to continue a violent struggle, and they didn't really trust Mandela too much because he's too willing to negotiate. They're worried he's going to give up too much. They want revolution, and Mandela's pushing for peace and negotiations, and they're worried that they're going to get less if they talk. However, Mandela is a key player in the negotiations. He is welcomed as a hero worldwide in 13 and then after he's released from prison and the negotiations start, he does go around the world to gain support, more worldwide support for him, by traveling into 13 African, European, and North American nations on tour in 1990, so he even goes to America. He becomes the ANC president in 1991 and moves on from there in negotiations. After his release, he calls for the continuation of sanctions. He wants to continue armed resistance until the National Party proves they're willing to talk. And so he's ready to keep on with the violence until the NP backs down. Once the NP backs down, he wants negotiations. He fully supports that, despite some of the ANC saying we should keep fighting. And that's also leads to kind of a split between him and his wife, which is a whole other can of worms. He is prepared to act forcefully against the NP. He's not going to back down on every case in these negotiations, especially when there are police involvement in the township violence, especially the Third Force in Baupatong. And he also starts to act presidential. In the case of the assassination of Chris Hani, there was about to be a civil war. People were pretty damn pissed. And so he gets on TV, even though he has no real power, he's not officially president or anything, he gets on TV and calms everybody down with his speech. And so he's already acting presidential before he's even president. After 94, he starts to focus on reconciliation between the races and starting to get everybody to calm down once he becomes the true president. The ANC, the South African Communist Party, and the unions, COSATU, they formed a three-part alliance, a tripartite alliance for the negotiation process. So they all work together. As well as the first election, they all kind of become one big party for the election, so they make sure that they are going to win, even though the ANC dominated the elections anyways. Cyril Ramaphosa was the chief negotiator for the ANC and this overall big alliance. He is a union leader, and so big on COSATU, and so he's kind of that part of the three-part alliance of ANC, communists, and union. He's the leader of the mine workers, which there are a lot of mines, gold and diamond, in South Africa, and he's key in forming the big union of COSATU. The other top negotiators here, Joe Slovo, key negotiator for the ANC. He is the top communist in South Africa, the Secretary General of the South African Communist Party, and one of the top leaders in the MK. And so he's pretty important to the struggle. However, people are pretty suspicious of him during the negotiations and throughout his life because, well, he's white and he's a communist. And so not a lot of people are going to trust him, but he's been there for the ANC, fighting in this fight since day one. And so despite that mistrust, he's there for them. He also helps in the negotiations, and he provides a major breakthrough with his compromise of a government of national unity for the first 5 years. And so he kind of negotiates that one out. He serves as minister in the new government in 1994, however he dies of cancer in 95. The Inkatha in Mangosuthu Buthelezi. He led the Inkatha Freedom Party, and I keep misspelling that. This is the correct spelling, Inkatha. Inkatha started as a Zulu cultural organization, but later on becomes a political party. And from 1972, he was the chief minister of the homeland of KwaZulu, so he's kind of in charge of his Zulu homeland. And so he's got experience running his own state, and so he wants to kind of continue that. He refuses to accept the government's offer of independence because it's not true independence, but if he can get a truly independent state, he might go for it. He just realized that this homeland idea of independence was just not true independence. Very critical of the ANC for their violence, use of guerrilla warfare, and support for economic sanctions. He saw the ANC as hurting South Africa in the long run. Criticized by a lot of black leaders for his willingness to work with the homeland system and promotion of Zulu nationalism. There's a lot of tension between the Inkatha and other groups, and this led to violent confrontations, especially in KwaZulu-Natal. There were clashes in townships around Johannesburg between Zulu migrant workers and the ANC township residents. And a lot of this violence, it really threatened negotiations. They're not willing to talk if they start to kill each other. So he plays a very unpredictable role because we're not sure if it's going to go violent or not with the Zulu. And so here he is dressed up, but also carrying around traditional weapons, which was definitely antagonizing and making problems. He threatens to boycott the election, which could have led just to further violence and another civil war. However, with last-minute negotiations, we do get him involved in the elections. He gets 3rd place, and he does serve as part of the coalition government, and violence between the Inkatha and the ANC breaks down. And that's it for today as far as the major roles of the parties.